Our next speaker has been called a dedicated intellectual entrepreneur. Dr. Ian Bremmer, I want to make sure he's here. Where is he? Oh, here he's coming. Impressive career spans the academic, investment, and policy-making communities. He is the president of Eurasia Group, a leading global political risk research and consulting firm. He earned his PhD in political science from Stanford University in 1994 and was the youngest ever national fellow at the Hoover Institution. He presently teaches at Columbia University and in 2007 was named a Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum. The author of 8 books and hundreds of scholarly articles, he is a frequent commentator in the national and international media. He will speak to us this morning about his vision of the future, including what his firm calls, quote, the end of the 9/11 era, unquote. Following the killing of Osama bin Laden, the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Iraq, and the establishment of an end date for the war in Afghanistan. Please join me in welcoming to the Naval War College, Dr. Ian Bremmer.
Thank you, sir. Great. Well, thank you very, very much. Delighted to be here. It's wonderful to hear the Undersecretary talk as well. It's my first chance to be here speaking to the Naval War College. I heard you had someone capsize in the audience this morning, which seemed appropriate from that perspective. I agree with the Undersecretary that it is a very exciting time. It's an exciting time to be a political scientist because geopolitics are in flux. They're in flux in a way that they have not been for decades. We have coming up in a week a G20 summit down in Mexico. And then we have a global summit on sustainability down in Rio. Now, I've written about something that I call a G0, which implies that the G20 is aspirational but doesn't really work. So it shouldn't surprise people that I'm not expecting much out of this summit. But why? Why do I think we have a G0 and not a G20? Let me start with that, because I think there are 5 reasons, 5 fairly straightforward reasons. Number 1, too many countries. Simply put, you've got more countries with the stake, with the ability to block, that need to be coordinated with, that are relevant on the global stage, that are relevant to deal with global challenges. Harder to deal with more countries. I mean, frankly, a G20 summit, you have 2 days. The old G7 summits, you had 2 days. If you're lucky, you get a speaking point in. It's more difficult to coordinate with more countries. Number 2, most of those new countries don't agree with us on many things. Fareed Zakaria, good friend of mine, has written quite famously about the rise of the rest. And this idea, the post-American world, as he called it, was one where other countries, new countries, developing countries, emerging countries, were also going to share the global stage with us. This wasn't a negative thing. It was something to be supported. It was something to rejoice about. And clearly it's great that we're combating a lot of global poverty. Clearly it's great that the people in these countries are doing better. But let's be clear about the downside, which is it's not the rise of the rest. It's the rise of the different. It's the rise of the other. It's the rise of countries that don't agree with us. Not the rise of the worse, not the rise of the evil, but the rise of the different. These are poor countries. These are countries that are more politically unstable. They are countries that have different economic and political systems. Most importantly, in the case of the largest of them, China, an authoritarian state and a state capitalist economy. The United States and the advanced industrial democracies have very similar political and economic systems. The ability to come to agreement on major challenges with a series of different countries with different priorities, obviously much, much harder. Number three, these different countries have very little experience doing international things compared to the United States and the Europeans and even the Japanese. Multinational corporations and trading houses from Europe and the US and Japan have been global for a long time. They have experience. When you talk about corporations from emerging markets, they've only started to become global very, very recently, if then in some cases. The bureaucracies, much more nascent in their global capacity. The philanthropy, much more nascent in their global capacity. Just not the same level of experience and capacity that the advanced industrial democracies have. Number four, the United States is less willing to do a lot of this stuff. The United States, increasingly, larger parts of the American population does not want to be the world's policeman. Larger parts of the US population does not want to be the lender of last resort. Larger parts of the US does not want to have the US lead globalization. This is a disturbing thing to think about. It is a particularly disturbing thing to address here. But certainly in a world where the United States has 15% real unemployment, in a world where average middle class net worth has gone from some median point from $110,000 to something like $77,000 over the course of from 2007 to 2010, when we actually see significant numbers of Americans that do not believe the American dream still applies to them or their children in the way that it has historically, then the willingness of the United States to provide the lifting that it is capable of providing is going to be challenged. It's number four. And number five, our allies are distracted. For 2 years now, the Europeans have been going through an extraordinary crisis that involves their fundamental political and economic fabric and identity. I believe they'll get through it. I believe the Eurozone will not collapse, will not fragment, but it's painful. And the ability to get the Europeans to focus in anything like consensus fashion to deal with global challenges, whether they are climate or economic statecraft or monetary policy or security, is much more limited than they have been. And we saw this from former Secretary Gates when he was talking about NATO just at the end of his tenure. And then Japan, 17 prime ministers in 22 years, which I believe is a record in Asia, unless you count Thai coups and things like that. They've just gotten through the worst year they've experienced since World War II. Fukushima, and I mean, this is a country that gets a very significant portion of its electricity, I think 30+% from nuclear energy, and they've just restarted the first nuclear reactor. It's extraordinary what they've been able to do. It's breathtaking. You go to the country and there's no social instability. You go to the country and they have completely rebuilt their supply chain. The infrastructure is fantastic. The resilience is there. But the ability to get the Japanese to take a greater leadership role on critical issues that matter to the US and matter to the world is limited. And so then you can talk about Canada, Australia, the Scandinavians, lovely, small. So we got 5 reasons. 5 reasons why, in my view, we don't have a G20. 5 reasons why Rio isn't going to work. 5 reasons why global stuff isn't happening the way global stuff used to happen. It happened after World War II, right? The United States was the only man left standing, and other countries did rise with our help. That was the rise of the rest. We had Japan, we had Europe, and we built global architecture. We built the Bretton Woods Accord on currency. We built the United Nations. We built the World Bank and the IMF. All of that stuff sounds global. World Bank sounds global. World Series sounds global. Got a Canadian team. That should be sufficient. It's not global. It's not global, it's US-led. And it worked for a long time. But over the last 30 years, the rise of the different began, and more countries started to matter. And the other reasons that I have spoken of have all continued to apply. And so now we have US-led global architecture. Underlying balance of power doesn't in any way reflect it. At some point, of course, that was going to crack. We've had shocks that have hit the world before. We had 9/11. We've had various crises, the Asian crisis, the peso crisis, the ruble crisis. We had the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the one that was big enough to really crack it, given that underlying shift in the balance of power, was, of course, the 2008 financial crisis. I call this the creative destruction of the geopolitical environment, right? We experience creative destruction in the marketplace all the time. Used to go to an independent bookstore, right? Some of us used to. And then Borders and Barnes & Noble comes along, and they either adapt or they die. And then Amazon comes along, and Borders or Barnes & Noble adapts or dies, right? That happens in the marketplace. It rarely happens geopolitically. I would argue it's happening now. And given those 5 reasons that I mentioned, any one of which would be sufficient to be a challenge to the global architecture, all 5 at the same time get you no capacity, in my view, to continue with US-led global architecture. Now, does that mean that the US is no longer the world's only superpower? No. Does this mean the US is in inexorable decline? No. It just means that we're not going to have US-led global architecture. We can have global architecture that doesn't function and isn't US-led. That's what some of what the G20 is right now. Or we can have US-led architecture that isn't global. Coalitions of the willing. We all know about coalitions of the willing in Iraq and Afghanistan, but we don't use that concept anywhere near the way we should outside of the strict security realm. We need to use it on climate. We need to use it on trade. We need to use it on economic statecraft. We need to use it on monetary policy. Because these are where the geopolitical challenges are increasingly coming from. How many global climate summits do we need to have that accomplish nothing before we realize we have to stop doing global climate summits? Doesn't mean we don't care about climate. We need to have summits with countries that will actually do something with us. And then we need to formulate the agenda. And if we do it soon enough, we can start focusing on mitigation. And if we wait, we'll start focusing on adaptation. And if we wait even longer, we'll do geoengineering. That's where we're going. Tell me what part of the timeline you want to get on, but that's where we're going. On trade, I think the US is starting to get this joke because we no longer care about Doha. We know we're not going to do a global Doha trade round. Instead, we're increasingly talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. That's our new idea for global trade. What's the TPP all about? Well, it means the United States with Canada and Mexico and some other like-minded countries across the big pond, like Japan and Australia and New Zealand and South Korea, we're going to form a stronger trade architecture, multilateral trade architecture. Where's China? Not in it. Where's Russia? Not there. Brazil? Not invited. Why? Because they don't agree with us on this stuff. If they do, they can join at some point in the future, indeterminate. Until then, let's do more stuff, right? May work, may not work. Even that's going to be hard in this environment, but much more likely than keeping to bang our heads about Doha. Now, before the summit we just had in Camp David, right, a number of our allies in Europe were talking privately about the idea of doing a transatlantic partnership that would look like the TPP, but would involve the Europeans as well. Makes sense for a growth agenda. Too distracted to get it done. Too much focus on things like the Euro crisis and Syria and the rest. And by the way, that was with the Russians not showing up. I thought that was funny, actually, because Putin, before that event, actually said, you know, this is looking dangerous. The world looks more like World War II, where the United States, buffered by its two vast oceans, took a long time before it decided it wanted to get in. And as a consequence, there was a lot more damage, right, that happened in Europe. A lot more horrifying loss of life that happened in Asia before the United States decided it wanted to get in. You want to talk about a polarized society? This isn't polarized, what we see right now. The debate about whether or not the U.S. should go into World War II, that was a polarizing debate, right? And then Putin said this, and on the one hand, I felt like, well, that's a point that makes sense. And then on the other hand, he then decided, well, no, I can't go to this meeting because I've got to appoint a cabinet, which is, of course, hard to do in an authoritarian state. So, but the funny thing is that now I'm starting to get a sense of my crowd, which is good. The funny thing about Putin not going is that what would Putin going have accomplished? On Syria and Iran, the Russians have been actively obstructive. On the Euro crisis and Afghanistan, the Russians have been actively irrelevant. And those were the four things that were discussed. You get where I'm going with we need to have meetings with folks we can do stuff with. I'm not saying actively trash the Russians, actively trash the Chinese. That would be a very dangerous thing to do. In fact, I am quite pleased that the United States has gotten the joke on how important the China relationship is. And so as a consequence, don't let the small stuff blow up the relationship. We saw this with Secretary Clinton's trip and the potential blow up over serious human rights dissident Mr. Chen. Could have gone a lot worse. And the United States and the Chinese, at the 11th hour, got together to ensure it did not. And furthermore, on currency, a lot of people saying we should slap tariffs on the Chinese if they don't shift their currency by 25% overnight. I've seen New York Times op-eds by Paul Krugman suggesting this. This is blatant stupidity, right? But thankfully, thank you. Thankfully, the Obama administration doesn't go there, right? I mean, you know, they understand that if you threaten to punch yourself in the face in response to China not moving on currency, while that may be a credible strategy, it is not an effective strategy, right? And we're not doing that. And furthermore, the Chinese are not doing that on Taiwan, right? We've sold a bunch of additional military stuff to the Taiwanese, and the Chinese are not being as belligerent about it because they know that fundamentally it's not a big deal. It's not really wrecking anybody's day, and the relationship is too important. We probably should get that joke more on Russia, right? I mean, Romney can say that Russia is America's lead geopolitical foe in the world, which is senseless, right? But he can say it because Russia thinks it doesn't matter that much. Obama sends my old friend and colleague Mike McFaul, great guy, smart guy, as ambassador to Russia, right? Huge human rights guy, huge opposition supporter, clearly going to antagonize the Russians. You would never do that to China. You would never do that to China because China is too important. I'd suggest you probably shouldn't do that to Russia either, right? Because why antagonize them needlessly? The point is, if we're going to antagonize these countries, let's please only do it needfully, because there will be more and more occasions where we will need to do it needfully. That is the concern. That is the concern of a G0 world. Let's never do it needlessly. And we need to get more of that joke. Now, as you know, the Obama administration eschews doctrine. They do not like doctrine, because doctrine implies long-term commitments, right, that reduce flexibility. But to the extent that there is doctrine coming out of the Obama foreign policy group, I think that they are around two fundamental things. One, economic statecraft, as Hillary Clinton was talking in October. And number two, the pivot to Asia, which we've heard a lot about from the Undersecretary. What do both of those things have in common? They both have in common fundamental concerns about the rise of China. Appropriately so, in my view. You asked Hillary Clinton what she thinks about China, and the response, and I've heard it many times, is, we, the United States, welcome the peaceful rise of China, as long as they behave the way we want them to. But do you expect them to do that? Well, not really. Well, then what? Well, then we have this pivot to Asia. What is the pivot to Asia? Well, that is a hedge in case they don't behave the way we want them to. And we've got Panetta going over, and Obama going over, and Hillary going over, everyone going over, meeting all of our allies and making commitments to our allies, all that sort of stuff. That's the pivot to Asia. That's a hedge. What's a hedge? Is that containment? I didn't say containment. Won't say containment. But I tell you, the Japanese hear containment. The Indonesians, the Philippines, Vietnamese, Australians, Singaporeans, and of course the Chinese. And that's why we have to be particularly careful. Because the pivot to Asia is appropriate. It is the right thing for us to do, and at the same time, it has the potential to facilitate a faster move towards the very behavior that we want to avoid. This is a hard balancing act for us to continue. Now, for the pivot to Asia to work over the long term, you have to have a bunch of countries in Asia that believe that American commitments are credible and durable and meaningful for them and profitable for them. That's going to get harder. It's going to get harder because on the one hand, you have a United States that's driving its integration primarily using security, and you have the Chinese that are doing it primarily using economic goodies. For that to be viable in 10 or 20 years' time, you have to have a series of leaders in the region that, number one, believe the United States is still willing to provide all of that support. And furthermore, you have to have the Chinese willing to allow them to maintain that relationship, given that they have a lot more economic and therefore political influence over these countries. That's going to be a lot harder in some countries than it will be for others. The pivot is a challenging long-term strategy. Furthermore, to get it right, I think the pivot cannot be as security heavy as it has been in its first year. I like all the security stuff, don't get me wrong. But the only thing that's really economic on the pivot right now is this Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is hard to do. It's complex. It involves lots of different pieces. And the U.S. has only been half-heartedly committed to it. I would do a lot more on coordinating economic statecraft. Here is a real point. You want to talk about security. I want to talk broadly about security. The United States must get economic statecraft in Asia right, because that's where the big challenges are going to be. But the problem is that the U.S. is not set up to do economic statecraft. Why not? Well, for one, our lead sort of ministry dealing with industry is the Department of Commerce, not our best department, right? It's big, it's not the best and the brightest, right? And it's unwieldy. Furthermore, the Department of Energy is separate, which doesn't make a lot of sense. USTR, small, extremely capable, separate. The Department of State, in my view, the best foreign service in the world, very well trained, right, with real competency exams to get in, incredible morale, but has very little links to the private sector. And yet they're the ones that are leading this right now, right? Our Chamber of Commerce is weak, and our corporations do not trust U.S. government, most of them. And they want the government out of their business. I tell you who does economic statecraft well. It's Japan. While we were doing foreign policy and security all over the world, they had us taking care of that. So what did they do? Industrial policy. They've got a Keidan-ren, right, that actually coordinates all of their top corporations strategically. They've got organizations like NEXI and JICA that look to provide governmental support for international investments and strategy. Their corporations are tight. They look for the long term. They're very, very global. And furthermore, they have a Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry that brings all of the stuff that the U.S. has in a diffuse way together, and that works very closely with government and corporate leaders. So I've got to tell you, here's an area where the United States actually needs to learn from its allies. The Japanese have nothing to teach us about security internationally. Really? They don't, right? They don't. But they have enormous amounts to teach us about economic statecraft. This is where we have to focus on building a stronger coalition of the willing. The Japanese, the Aussies, New Zealand, South Korea, and our European friends as well. And by the way, Canada. Because do we have a fight coming with the Chinese when we talk about the Arctic? The Chinese position on the Arctic is very simple. Effectively, nobody lives there from their perspective, right? We would probably say the same thing. Effectively, nobody lives there. Huge amounts of resources underneath that ice, which isn't going to be there for very long. Chinese have 1.3 billion people. That's a fair percentage of the world population. They deserve that percent of the resources that are under the polar ice cap. I mean, from a humanist perspective, we can understand that. The Chinese, of course, have no geographic contiguity, right? Like the Canadians do, or like we do because we bought Africa cheap, which is good. I mean, Alaska cheap. Smart. So the point is, right, we have a fight coming. We have to get economic statecraft right with the Canadians, who right now think we're ignoring this issue. We can't. We have to get the private sector involved too. So those are a few points that I think are relevant on this issue. Now, the Undersecretary talked about what keeps him up at night. Nothing really keeps me up at night because I'm generally tired. But if something did, I tell you what would keep me up at night. What would keep me up at night is the possibility of WikiLeaks hitting China. That's a single thing out there that would worry me more than anything else, right? I remember when WikiLeaks hit the United States. I was in Dubai at the time, and I was sitting next to, I think it was Minister of Finance from Qatar, who told me that he believed that we leaked WikiLeaks ourselves because it made us look good. And I said, you know, if we did that, that would probably get leaked, right? Because conspiracy theory a little bigger than it needed to be. But the point, what did we learn from WikiLeaks? Millions of classified documents, ambassadorial cables, stuff from the secretary. What did we learn from WikiLeaks? We learned that Karzai is a crooked man. I found this shocking. I had no idea. We learned that Hillary Clinton believed that Argentine President Cristina Kirchner was emotionally volatile. Shocking, shocking development, right? We learned nothing. We knew all this stuff. Smart people that read the newspaper. We knew people that have blogs. We knew this stuff. When Bo Xilai's stuff came out in China, Chinese had no idea. The fact that he was caught wiretapping surveillance on Hu Jintao, the Chinese people had no idea. If we ended up with millions of documents that actually showed what the folks that run the country, who are engineers and also billionaires, actually were doing, as the Russians used to say, the Soviets, кто кого, who does what to whom, that would be a very seriously destabilizing thing for China. And therefore, for us, because they are on their way to becoming the world's largest economy. Here is my problem. This is what should keep us awake at night, is that the country that is about to become the world's largest economy will still be a poor country, will be a poor country that has to control information to stay stable, is a country that knows that it must fundamentally transform its economic and political system away from state capitalism towards consumer-driven economy to continue to succeed and grow, which is a challenge of monumental scale that has never been attempted with an economy the size of China's. I hope they will succeed. We should all hope they succeed. But there is more risk around that transformation for us and everyone else than anything else in the world. The Middle East is not close to that. North Korea, not close. AFPAC, not close. By the way, I love the notion of the pivot to Asia, which kind of requires the redefinition of AFPAC as the Middle East, right? Because clearly we're not pivoting to AFPAC. That's not happening. So someone should officially do that, just so it's clear to everyone. AFPAC, no longer in Asia, now in the Middle East. The one thing I will say, by the way, coming off of the Undersecretary's presentation, which I thought was outstanding, was on the India front. That's one part of our pivot to Asia that's going to really have a hard time working. Because the Indians do not want to be put in a position by us to be the front line of defense vis the Chinese. They are extremely savvy about this, and they want no part of it. They do not want a big strategic relationship with us. They want lots of little cooperation points with us, lots of little cooperation points with China. Keep us out of your big geopolitical machinations, please. Right? It's going to be challenging. Furthermore, the Indians are making a ton of money out of China right now, a ton. Because I know you used to all see these, cover stories of India and China, the great superpowers, Chindia, the rising. India and China both have 1 billion people. They're both in Asia. Aside from that, they have nothing in common. Nothing. Right? And that is useful for India because it means their economies are not competing. They're very complementary. India per capita income just over $1,000. In China, it's about 5,000. Increasingly, you see Chinese companies actually taking manufacturing out of China, low end, and bringing it to India. You have the Indian entrepreneurs going to China and helping them with management and the rest. If you talk to any Indian businessman of size, they will not talk to you about their concern of the string of pearls. They will not talk to you about their concerns about, Chinese strategically vis Pakistan. They will not. They will talk to you about, I am making a ton of money in China with the Chinese. Thank you very much. Don't get me involved in your games. So again, we strategically need to be aware of the fact that the pivot to Asia is hugely welcomed. By Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore was writing op-eds saying, where are you guys, a few years ago? By SBY in Indonesia, President Widodo, and anyone who replaces him in another year and a half. By any of the last 17 Japanese prime ministers and the next 17 that we'll see in the next 10 years. Any of them, right? Really appreciated. The South Koreans, another story that you have to watch out for. The younger generation in South Korea feels radically different than the older generation. Radically different. Very much concerned about U.S. antagonism towards China, sees China as the opportunity. Those are the two we have to be much more cautious about as we think about how the pivot is going to work. Final quick point before I open it up to questions, which I said I was allowed to do, and I love interacting, so it's more fun, is I've talked a lot, big strategic picture, where I think the risks and opportunities are. Where do I think this world is heading? I don't believe that the G0 is sustainable. I don't believe that we're going to, for a long time, have a world that has an absence of global leadership on all of these key issues. And what I think is likely to happen is that we're going to move in a much more regional direction, but those regions will be governed radically differently. I talked about Asia already. Asia, right now, security increasingly towards the United States, economics increasingly towards China, hard to maintain that balance over time. Europe, common political and economic values becoming more, not less institutionalized, if I'm right, and it doesn't fall apart. Eurasia, driven by, frankly, security and energy relations and dependence on Russia, much more informal, much more coercive. And the Middle East, not driven by one power. Middle East, with the United States playing less of a role, with the Europeans and the Japanese not there, with the Russians and the Chinese very, very narrow in their intentions and interests. The powers that matter in the Middle East are Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, and maybe over time Egypt. Those three countries have completely different preferences for what is actually happening in the Middle East and who should win and who should lose. It's not about energy, it's primarily sectarian. The Saudis support Sunni Arab monarchies. The Iranians support largely disenfranchised Shia populations. The Turks support largely secularized urban middle classes. If that is the direction the Middle East keeps going, we're going to see a lot more conflict in the Middle East. Asia and the Middle East, clearly the two regions, and you guys don't need to hear that from me, that we are going to have the greatest geopolitical tensions in. But for us, the challenge will clearly be much more dramatically out of Asia than anywhere else. And in that way, I think we really should be aligned with the broad parameters of the doctrine that we presently see. Final point before I open to questions. I said that I did not believe the U.S. was in decline. I don't. I also don't think it's a very relevant question. I mean, whether or not you think the U.S. is in decline, the U.S. is not going to do a Marshall Plan for Europe. It's not happening. They've asked. We're not doing it. Not the Democrats, not the Republicans, nobody. Whether or not you think the U.S. is in decline, we're taking our troops out of Afghanistan in 2014. The American people support that, right? Whether or not you think the U.S. is in decline, Assad is still in Syria. There are just going to be more. We're not going to have a global trade deal, a global climate deal. This is not about the U.S. in decline. In fact, in a G0 world, the U.S. dollar is doing better than it did before. That's not decline. U.S. treasuries? Anyone try to get a mortgage recently? Right? That's not decline. But here's the problem. The problem is that the reason why everyone is coming to the U.S. is not because we're getting stronger. It's because everything else looks so damn scary, right? I mean, if you're with a bunch of campers and a bear chases you, you don't need to outrun the bear. You just need to outrun the other campers, right? Swimming with the shark, don't need to outswim the shark, just your sister. I have a bunch of these. The point is, that gives the United States much more rope than we should want to have. There's no sense of urgency. We can waste the financial crisis if we want to. The Europeans can't. We can waste it. We may well do it. We have what I call a safe haven curse. You've heard of the resource curse? Countries have natural resources. They don't bother to do political and economic reform because they don't need to until they run out of resources, and then they have a problem. United States has a safe haven curse. S&P downgraded us, Standard & Poor's. We didn't care. Do it again. It's not going to affect the economy, it just makes S&P look stupid, right? It's true. But, and I think for that reason S&P will probably stop downgrading us because they know it made them look dumb. But the point is, we do not face a fiscal cliff. 2013 happens, President Obama again or President Romney, same Congress, slightly different Congress, decide that they are not, in their wisdom, going to deal with the long-term deficit. We will not be punished much for that. Maybe not at all. Why? Because the rest of the world still looks really scary. Where else are you putting your money? Gold's not a country. Where are you going? You going to Canada? You go Australia? Go Scandinavia? It's small stuff. You go in Europe? You've got to be kidding me. Right? Japan is also a safe haven. And so therefore, they're not getting pressured. This is no longer a world that is just driven by growth. It's a world that's driven by growth and resilience. The United States actually grows better than other large advanced industrial democracies, and they're very resilient. Nobody asks me about Occupy Wall Street anymore. Nobody. Why? It happened for a few weeks, then it stopped. We're not going to blow up our country. The institutions aren't going to be threatened. The military, not going to be threatened. We have strong and durable institutions, and that is both a blessing and, in some occasions, a curse. And I think for the long term, we do need to focus on both of those. So I hope you found this worthwhile. I thank you again very much for inviting me. I think I've got about 20 minutes left for questions, and I hope you'll ask a bunch of them. And I already see a couple. Let me start with you, ma'am, right in front. Oh, thank you.
You're Janice Marconi, Marconi Works International. You brought up something, one on information, two on South Korea. South Korea is connected digitally, I think 99% of their population. From a couple of factoids from this year's Consumer Electronics Forum, the number of connections, digital connections, internet connections in China is supposed to increase threefold by 2015. 2/3 of that is supposed to be on mobile devices. Now, China by 2015 won't be, 95% digitally connected. But given those figures, what are the implications?
Well, I think, what am I doing? I'm not talking to that. I have a mic, it must be Mike. The interesting thing about China and the internet revolution is that it's kind of separate from the one that the rest of us are having. Facebook just had an IPO and made a lot of money, right? It was very funny. I was doing an interview the other day and someone asked me if I bought Facebook stock, and my response was, the last time I saw a petulant 28-year-old running something worth billions, it had nuclear weapons. So I decided not to do that. Glad I got to use that. So, but the point is that the Facebook IPO, you've got 500 million people on the internet right now in China. No Facebook. No Facebook. No Twitter. Google very slow and they don't use it. If I were advising the Chinese government, I would tell them to kick out Google. I mean, I'm not, but if I were. Because why the hell would you want an American corporation that we know, if there's a problem, is going to give information to the NSA and work closely with the White House to help track terrorists and everything else? Why would you want them having that kind of data over your people? You would not. Not with the brittleness that you face on the information side, not with the cyber war going on. So what we have now is the world's fastest growing internet market is a separate internet from the West. And it's not just that. They want to do the same thing on telecom standards. They failed on 3G. It wasn't developed enough. On 4G, they're trying. If they don't get it then, they'll do it next generation. You talk to Cisco. Talk to Motorola. Talk to the American corporations. They're very worried about this. We used to have a world of US-led globalization. That global market is fragmenting. We didn't need economic statecraft when we created all the standards. When you have a world that has a different internet, when you have a world that has fragmented standards, you need economic statecraft. And I think on the IT side, this is more important than anywhere else. If we have to pick a couple of sectors that we want to start, we start with IT because it's dangerous. But it's also an area where the US does have advantages, right? And potentially critical ones. Other questions? Sir. I think it's really important. I mean, the great thing about technology is that the United States still has an enormous advantage over other countries in the world, and particularly over China. If you look at advanced biotech, you look at the nanotech industries, and you look at the actual patents that are being applied for, they are overwhelmingly in the US. And if they're not in the US, they're in South Korea, they're in Germany, a little in Great Britain. There are none in the emerging market world. Now, technology, of course, we all hear that the emerging markets are becoming much better at certain kinds of technology. That's true. They're becoming much more advanced in manufacturing the rest. But the most advanced technologies, where we will find the new thing, for example, the energy revolution on unconventional oil and gas, dominated by the United States. Utterly dominated. American corporations, American universities, American shareholders. It's really important. So there's no question that technological advantage is huge. Obviously, to the extent that there's a big issue that we've attracted the world's best talent, that the best talent, the immigration questions as to whether or not we're going to continue to. We need to if we want to have access to the best brains in the world. We need to make sure it's easy for them to come, easy for them to work. The other point around that is our universities are by far the best in the world, but some of them are now setting up other universities that are going to be just as good in places like the Gulf and in Singapore and in Hong Kong because there's money there. Your ability to buy big technology and buy big corporations is significant. And the United States can say, okay, we're going to have CFIUS. We're going to have programs that will stop people from buying those. Yeah, but are we going to coordinate that with our allies? Because if we don't, they'll just go and buy them there. We have to have coalitions of the willing on technology above all else. And this is a country that doesn't do that well on the economic side. So again, and keep in mind, our corporations, which are developing this technology, are not actually very savvy about this. I mean, ExxonMobil, big oil corporation, right? If anyone that reads Steve Cole's new book knows just how savvy they are. They've been global for a long time. They understand that governments can ruin their day. It's happened, right? And they understand that a good relationship with the government can do very well. Big information companies, a lot of them were just started 10 years ago. A lot of them are run by people that are engineers. They don't know anything about government. They don't know anything about politics. Their view is, look, we've got one global market. We just want to hit the consumers. I remember a conversation I had with Eric Schmidt when he was CEO of Google, telling me many years ago, about 7, 8 years ago, that he knows he has a problem with the Chinese government, but that's okay because the Chinese people are on Google's side. You've got to be kidding me, right? And he gets the joke now, but he's been in the war for a while, for a few years. But you've got companies like Research in Motion, RIM, that does the BlackBerry. You know, their head government relations group was saying our purpose is to insulate our CEO from government officials, so they don't have to deal with that. They can just do the business of Research in Motion and BlackBerry. Well, we see how well that's gone for them. You've got a culture problem. That the entrepreneurs that are running these things don't want to deal with economic statecraft. They just see the world as a global market. Information should be free. But if the world doesn't work that way, you have a problem. And again, I see this as the single principal national security issue that our country must address. Because I do trust, when I see a presentation like the one I just saw from the Undersecretary, I trust that we've got the other stuff more or less covered. I know that there's a lot of work that goes into it. I see a presentation, I can sleep about that. But again, you give me some coffee right before I go to bed. The IT stuff is going to give me a problem. There's no question. Others, sir.
I'm Charles Reed from Rhode Island. One subject which
Pardon me for a moment. There are students and faculty watching us off-site. Please use your microphones to ask your questions so they can hear those. Thank you.
Thank you.
Push it, okay. I'm Charles Reed from Rhode Island, and one subject which you have not mentioned is trade, currencies, the collapse of the dollar, the fact that China is negotiating with Japan to do negotiations in the Chinese yuan to no longer do trade in the US dollar. What future do you see for the US dollar in international trade? Will the US dollar collapse? May I have your input, please?
So what I have talked about trade in the dollar, but I've talked about it in the near term. I haven't talked about it as much in the long term. I kind of implied that at the end. Right now, there's no collapse of the dollar right now. The dollar's doing fantastically well right now. Everyone's in the dollar. Everyone's in treasuries. These are trading at record low rates. And you say, why? Again, because everything else looks scary. Do I believe that, the Chinese are going to internationalize their currency anytime soon? No. But I tell you, your question is important because the Chinese do not like how tied they are to the U.S. economy. They don't like it at all. They want to be able to hedge. And how are they doing that? Well, they're doing that in part by building their own consumer capacity. They're doing it in part by doing bilateral deals, denominating currency locally with the Brazilians and with the Indonesians and other countries. And they're doing it by stockpiling commodities, right? But all three of those things will not get them away from the dollar. Now, the one thing the Chinese could do that would really terrify me on the dollar is if the Chinese went to Germany and said, you know what, we're going to pony up. It's going to be a Chinese Marshall Plan for Europe. We're going to go in it with you, Germany. Let's have some rules around this. Let's make the euro strong because we can use it as a hedge against the dollar. That would be really smart for us. It's really good for you economically. And in return, why don't you tear up the arms export restrictions that you have to China? That would be a good quid pro quo for that for us, right? I tell you, you guys want to game some stuff out? Game that out, right? That'd be interesting. But I tell you, that's not going to happen anytime soon. And the reason, and we're very fortunate about this, in the same way that I said we have a G0 problem because the emerging markets don't do global, we also have more time to get this right because the emerging markets don't do global. The Chinese are very incremental and risk averse. you would have to get a huge group of people to say, let's go and put a big pile of money and bet it on Europe. And the Chinese are hugely focused on their own domestic issue. They're not being that long-term and strategic. Surprising, right? Because they're so long-term and strategic when they think about China. But when you ask them to really get outside their comfort zone, they won't do it. I was talking to some senior Chinese officials recently asking about Afghanistan. I was like, come on, guys. The Brits did it. Soviets did it. We did it. Isn't it your turn? I thought I would try, you know? A little bait and switch. And they said no. They said no. And they're not even, even Pakistan, which is traditionally a place that the Chinese play a lot of ball, they've been so slow to provide aid to Pakistan. And they really could get a lot of leverage out of it. But that's not China's principal problem right now. China's really, you think that we're distracted at home? You think the Europeans are distracted at home? The Chinese are distracted at home. Vastly, vastly more than anybody in the developed world. So again, that kind of means that the dollar has a longer period to run, but it also means that we have more rope with which to hang ourselves. And my concern is we will use some of it, right? Winston Churchill once said that the Americans always do the right thing right after every other choice has been exhausted. And I thought it was funny. Rahm Emanuel, when he was actually running the Obama campaign, quoted Machiavelli, I'm not sure he knew he was doing that, by saying, never waste a good crisis. And then the Obama administration proceeded to waste a crisis, right? And I'm not saying that the Republicans would have done any differently. Again, I'm not a partisan guy. It's not the point. The point is, the Europeans, as hard as this has been, are not wasting their crisis. They're not. And the reason they're not is you have to understand the European crisis is not only an economic crisis. It is a political crisis. And we're criticizing the Europeans because we want them to just fix the economic crisis. And the Germans, rightly in my view, are saying we are not going to only fix the economic crisis. We're going to fix the economic and political crisis in tandem. It's much more painful. It's much harder. It takes longer. It means you've got to do things like banking union and fiscal compact. It means you have to squeeze all of these peripheral states and make it hurt because otherwise their politicians would never accept this stuff. Look, the Germans got Berlusconi out and they got a technocratic government in that is fantastically well respected by the Italians that wasn't even democratically elected. That's hard to do. That required economic pain. And then we're saying, no, you should take one big bite. No, you take one big bite. That's what the Americans do. Let's just bail out the banks and then forget about it, right? It's like Ronco, set it and forget it. This is not an infomercial, right? This is real life. We have to do this stuff. And the Americans, unfortunately, don't need to do it soon. That's the dollar danger, but it's a long-term danger. It's not a 5-year danger. It's not a 5-year danger. I think I have time for maybe 2 or 3 more. Sir.
Fred Kobrick from Sudbury. I was in Vietnam recently and they talked a lot about economic partnership with the United States and good private enterprise deals and all of that. They also talked a lot about being squeezed by China. China's squeezing them by damming rivers and then wanting to sell the power back to them and all that, and worries about being a 5th star on China's flag. How real do you think that is in terms of the region, not just Vietnam? People are starting to mumble about China feeling that if we have a Monroe Doctrine, why can't they have a Monroe Doctrine for the South China Sea? And are we and the Chinese Navy going to be feeling that as time goes on? What is your view of the region?
Yeah, again, it's very fair from the Chinese perspective. Why can't they have their own backyard that we can't touch? Why not? Well, because you're China. That's what we say. I loved it when John Bolton was once asked about North Korea. Well, look, all these countries have nuclear weapons. Israel has nuclear weapons. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Why can't we have nuclear weapons? And John Bolton said, because you're North Korea. Which it may not be satisfying for the North Koreans, but at least it's honest, right? We don't have a good reason for why the Chinese can't have that influence except for they're China, right? And if you're Chinese, that doesn't work for you. So we are going to have a fight over this stuff because there are countries, not just Vietnam, Burma, right? Burma, a military dictatorship, desperately wants to hedge away from China and have options. And they want to work with the United States. There's a real opportunity here, and the United States, I think, is taking advantage of that, as are the Europeans. And the Japanese, they're over there like regularly. taking their Singapore offices and they're just saying, let's just move them. Let's just move them to Burma because we're going to make money. It's smart. I definitely see this in Vietnam because the Vietnamese have a very strong military partnership with the United States, and they are absolutely concerned because when the Vietnamese did their economic stimulus after the 2008 financial crisis, they oriented all of it at the north on infrastructure. Why? Because that's the only way they could take advantage of Chinese growth. Economically, the Vietnamese are just getting swallowed in the way that Taiwan's already been swallowed. I know that Taiwan's our ally, though we don't talk about them very much anymore, but 1 million Taiwanese live in mainland China, and they make huge money in mainland China. And when they hedge away from Shanghai because it's too expensive, they don't go to Indonesia, they just go further into China. That's all they do. And the Chinese government's been very smart. They said, let's take the Taiwanese and let's preference them in their investments economically and make it easier for them to come in. There's a lot of remarriage that happens, intermarriage that happens. Mainlanders coming to Taiwan, marrying Taiwanese men. It no longer matters what our military relationship is with Taiwan. They are gone. Economically, they've already been swallowed. So the question is, you've got countries out there like Vietnam and Burma and Indonesia, and even a country like Australia, which has enormous natural resources, and the Chinese are overwhelming them with inbound investment, and they're worried. None of them want to get Taiwanized. The Japanese do not want to get Taiwanized, and that's where the American pivot plays in. Again, the Indians don't feel this way, and the younger generation of South Koreans do not feel this way, and we need to be sensitive and aware of that, or we'll screw this up. I think I can do one or two more. I think I've got till 20. Yes, sir. Microphone? I think it's on your chair. Okay. Or just speak into your water bottle. I find this very effective. I will repeat it if you can't. Okay. I think there's a problem. Huh. Can you do me a favor? Just say it so I can hear it, and I'll repeat the question. I don't mind. Just repeat it. Just say it, and I'll repeat it. No, it's not working. Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Ed Walbridge. I'm from Chicago. Regarding China as a potential enemy, if we wanted to enforce our will on them militarily, would it not be less expensive to simply cut off all imports from China? We threaten to do that, and also inflate the dollar because they have such high holdings of treasury. This would be economic as opposed to military. Might that not be cheaper?
I think the Chinese actually cut off his microphone. I think that's what happened with that question. I think. The question was, rather than the potential confrontation that I've been talking about with China, wouldn't it be cheaper to just kind of inflate the dollar and cut off their imports, or threaten to do so? And the answer is no. It would not be. And the reason it would not be is because we are dependent on China. We're all used to mutually assured destruction, right, with nuclear weapons. We are experiencing mutually assured economic destruction with the Chinese. It is very clear. You try to go a day without consuming stuff that is made in China. You cannot do it. It is not possible. We need cheap stuff. You want to see Walmart collapse? How many American companies do you want to see go out of business? What would you like American unemployment to be? How would you like to have a depression in this country that actually makes the Great Depression pale in comparison? If you would like to do that, your strategy is a very good one to put into place, right? I know that you weren't actually recommending it. I'm just saying as a question. But the answer is no. Not no, but hell no, as my mom used to say, because I was a difficult child. That's the way I would go. I could take one more question, right? Go all the way in the back. I see someone in uniform, and that means I have to go to you first.
Good morning, Dr. Bremmer. Lieutenant Commander Dave Archer, actually a student graduating this week. I read your book, The J Curve, And I wonder if you would ever add an afterword or maybe another portion to it. I'm curious about your thoughts on North Korea in our lifetimes, because it was a significant part of my study, especially with what kind of potential there is there with so much information entering, cell phone, DVD, etc. Could that ever arrive at a critical mass? How might economic statecraft work if it would become more open? Would they move toward South Korea? Would they move toward China? And thank you.
Thank you very much. I've done a few pieces on the J curve in the last months. I did one in the FT. It was a big article when the Arab Spring hit last year. So I feel like I've been updating it just because it's so relevant to daily events. I don't know if I'm up for having I guess I could do a new preface. But the question is relevant because it's coming up a lot. And North Korea what do I think about North Korea in our lifetimes? Well, I mean, I see that there are a lot of generations represented here. So I think it depends on which of us you're talking about. But don't make age jokes. It's just a bad idea. I think that, I mean, what's so interesting about North Korea, so the idea of the J curve is that, you have this relationship between openness and stability. And some countries are stable because they are open, like the United States and Japan and so forth. Some countries are stable because they're closed, right? North Korea is stable because it's closed. And it's a J, right? And the left side of the J is very, very steep. So if you're very, very closed and you open up a little bit, you can fall apart very fast. And the whole curve shifts up or down on the basis of economic capacity and the rest. The North Koreans are stable because they're closed. There's no question. If you were to have investment into North Korea that was free and open, they would fall apart very quickly. But the North Koreans are aware of this. So if the United States were to say, okay, no more sanctions, let's just invest in North Korea, North Koreans aren't going to let us do that. In fact, that kind of behavior would probably provoke them to do something very dangerous because they would see that this would collapse their government. The Cubans have played this game for years. The best you can do in that environment is very incremental, unless you don't care, unless they don't have any power to blow you up, right? But in the case of North Korea, they do, because South Korea is right there, Seoul's right there, and even conventional artillery would devastate the South Korean economy. We have to worry about North Korea. I mean, after my China WikiLeaks concern, and the second biggest concern would be definitely North Korea falls apart, right? Or is about to fall apart and therefore provokes conflict with the South. I mean, I saw that Kim Jong-un recently apologized about the fact that the missile didn't work, but then said the military wasn't to blame. Now, I suspect under Kim Jong-il, members of the military would have been shot, or it would have been in car accidents, which is the way they frequently do it over there. They do, and there aren't many cars in Pyongyang, so it's obviously staged, right? But I think that, but for him to say that certainly implies, well, the military's in charge. But do we know who in the military's in charge? Do we know how many? Are they all in agreement? You're talking about the world's most totalitarian state, which is going through a transition to a kid that clearly isn't running the country. And they have nukes, and they're right next to South Korea. That should unnerve us a little bit, right? I think it should. So again, thank you so much for inviting me. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope the rest of your conference is very successful. Thank you.